Hi, folks, and welcome to All Over the Place with Dara Star Tucker. I'm really glad to be with you this week for an episode on the pressing question on a lot of folks' minds: should Biden step down? This is a tough one for me, I have to say. A lot of folks like to accuse me of playing both sides from the middle, but with this particular episode, I think it's really important to walk very carefully and to weigh this issue out thoughtfully. So if you are where I am on this issue right now, which is I don't really know what the best course of action is on this issue. I just hope it gets resolved very quickly. You may appreciate hearing what I have to say. And I'd like to hear from you, my all over the place audience. Do you like these episodes where it's just me and the microphone? Do you like it when I bring in guests, when I have conversations with people? Or do you like a combination of both? A few episodes where it's just me, a few episodes where it's the guest. Let me know in the comments section if you are watching this on YouTube. And another note about YouTube, this is going to be one of those episodes where we do not have a visual this week. If you're listening to it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it's not going to matter to you. But for the YouTube audience, this is one of those rare occasions where I'm doing this as an audio only episode. This was just one of those weeks where it was easier for me to do it that way. I will be back with the visuals next week. I can promise you that. I want to remind you, as I always do, about the Patreon. If you are not a supporter of the podcast through Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker. That's a place where you can offer monthly support to sustain the work that I do. If you are already a Patreon member, thank you 1,000 times. Thank you so much. You make this work possible. For those of you in the Philly area, or if you will be in the Philly area in a couple of weeks, South Jazz Kitchen in Philadelphia on the 21st of July. I have two shows, one at 6:30 and one at 8 o'clock. So you can go to southjazzkitchen.com to get those tickets. They probably will sell out. I would love to meet some of my all over the place listeners in person, so I hope you can make it if you are going to be in the Philadelphia area July 21st. And now I'm going to send you on to this week's episode. I'm working it out, you guys. We're all trying to figure out how to get our bearings in the midst of this chaos. Ultimately, I just do not want to see Donald Trump do another term. That's the final goal as far as I'm concerned. How we get there is almost immaterial to me at this point. So you're going to hear my thoughts on this whole issue. I hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, please give the podcast a rating on whatever platform you listen to it on. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all next week. Well, hi there, folks. My name is Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me here on KJLH. I'm so happy to be with you once again to talk about the issues that matter. You can find me online on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. You can also find me on the KJLH Instagram page. That's Radio Free KJLH on Instagram. Everywhere else online, including TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Threads, you can find me at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Well, there is a lot happening, a lot going on right now in the world, particularly in regard to the election, the 2024 election. I think it's getting to be crunch time now, and a lot of folks are starting to plug in that haven't been plugged in before, particularly with the call to action that Taraji P. Henson sent out at the BET Awards, trying to wake folks up about this Project 2025. You all know that I have done a lot of content around that. I've done an entire explainer video. I've done a couple of episodes about that here on KJLH. I think that's something we need to be heavily focused on right now. But unfortunately, what is making headlines right now are these questions around Joe Biden and whether or not he should resign. This is becoming a pressing issue, a much greater issue, honestly, than what I and a lot of other people thought it was going to be. We knew that the debate performance was rough. We didn't necessarily know that it was going to get to the point where people were calling on him to resign. And this movement is starting to pick up steam. And so what I want to talk about in this episode of The Breakdown is where we are now with the question of whether or not Joe Biden will resign, whether he should resign, who will replace him, and is Kamala Harris a viable option? So there's a lot to get into today. We obviously all know what the timeline has been. I want to remind us at the beginning of the year, this is how much things can change. Now, let's not forget, we're in July right now. Things can change within just a few months, because I want to remind us at the beginning of the year, we were kind of riding high. Those of us who are in support of the Democratic Party, we were riding high because, as we've all known for a while, Joe Biden, he's the oldest president we've ever had. He's obviously aged 4 years since we first elected him, and there is some cognitive decline happening. There is a slowing down that's happening. He really wasn't all that fast when he first took office, but he was an alternative to Trump. So we voted him in. We knew that he was an experienced lawmaker. We knew that he would bring some calm and some reason to the country. He was the antidote that we needed to get away from the madness of Donald Trump. He was what was needed in 2020. Now it's 4 years later. At the beginning of the year this year, though, we were riding a little bit high. The State of the Union address had happened. People were concerned about cognitive decline then. And he performed very well. And I think a lot of people were actually pleasantly surprised. We got through it. Everyone was pumping their fists. We were feeling like we were in a strong position for November. And of course, we all know between January or February and November, a lot is bound to change. And a lot has changed. Now, here we are in July. And if we're honest, a lot of us are in panic mode, wondering what we are going to do about the fact that we now have what is a very weak candidate in Joe Biden. Even if he's someone that you respect, he's actually gotten quite a bit done over the span of his presidency. I don't think his accomplishments have been talked about nearly enough, but he has been a very successful president thus far. Now, let's just quickly run down what some of those accomplishments are in case we're not all aware. First of all, he passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which lowered insurance premiums for 13 million people. It saved a lot of folks hundreds of dollars a year through clean energy tax programs. It put a $2,000 annual cap on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for seniors. He put us back in the Paris Climate Accord, and he pledged to cut emissions in half by 2030. The Inflation Reduction Act imposed a 15% minimum tax on billion-dollar corporations, and he didn't raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year. Unemployment is down to 3.5%. I'm just telling you what this man has accomplished. Unemployment is down to 3.5%. He passed the infrastructure bill. He passed a veterans bill. He helped pass one of the first significant gun bills in 30 years. He helped pass Respect for Marriage Act, protecting LGBTQ folks. He appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. He's appointed more Black women as federal judges than any president in history. Do not let anybody tell you that this man has not done his job. He pushed through all sorts of blockades to forgive billions of dollars in student loans in spite of all those lawsuits and all of the pushback that he was getting from Republicans to try to prevent him from doing so. And he pardoned anybody who had been convicted of marijuana possession at a federal level. This man has worked, okay? And yes, I know there are valid criticisms for him, for the Democrats, but they have worked. They have gotten legislation pushed through, unlike the Republicans who have accomplished nothing legislatively, absolutely nothing. But obviously, the debate performance changed everything. And it's becoming obvious now that a lot of folks in his inner circle have been shielding us from just how much his cognitive decline has progressed, even in the last year or so. It's obvious that he has good days, he has not so good days, and unfortunately, he was caught in a not so good day on that debate stage. And that has now thrust the Democratic Party into a state of panic. And I don't think that's overstating where we are right now. Now, I want to quickly play a video for you that I did on my socials, on TikTok and on Instagram, where I reacted to the debate. These are my thoughts in the immediate aftermath of the debate. Of course, we all know what we saw. It was abysmal. It was concerning. But in my estimation, it's really important that we keep the bigger picture in mind. So these were my thoughts immediately post-debate. This was the reminder that I wanted to share with my social media audience about how we should be framing that debate performance.
Okay, this is what I want to say. I have a mutual named Jamel Bowie, who's really, really, really smart, does some great political analysis. He is a writer for the New York Times. If you're not following him already, please follow Jamel Bowie. My mutual Jamel Bowie likes to say, when you are voting for the president, you are not just voting for a person. You are voting for a cohort. You are voting for every cabinet position that president is responsible for appointing. You are voting for the head of the Department of Justice. You are voting for Attorney General. You are voting for Secretary of State. In this election, you will be voting for 3 Supreme Court justices. Just as significantly, you are voting for tons of federal judges, appellate judges. There's a lot on the line, and I think we're all looking around like, are we gonna be okay? But I just want to remind us to keep our eyes focused on the issues, which unfortunately were not at the forefront last night, which is what I hate about debates, period. I don't like the format. The issues are never at the forefront, but even more so last night. So while we're all taking in the theater of what happened last night, let's not forget the president comes into office with an army of cohorts. The president's the head of the army too, by the way, all of the armed forces. Let's not forget that they come in with an army of cohorts that represent a point of view, a philosophy that will be applied across the board. It's never about one person. Let us not forget.
It's never about one person. That applies across the board. If you're voting for Democrats, if you're voting for Republicans, if you're voting for independents or any other party, it's never about one person. And that goes for Donald Trump. If that man is allowed to re-enter the office of the presidency, he comes with a cohort, a coalition of very, very nefarious characters. Now, I want to be clear that where I feel that the focus should be right now is on Donald Trump. I feel like that's one thing that we can all agree on. Donald Trump is a terrible, terrible candidate. This man has been convicted of 34 felonies. He lies for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He tried to foment an insurrection, a takeover of the U.S. government, and still somehow he is seen as a viable candidate. And I will never get my head around why he is still seen as a viable candidate, why we are asking questions around whether or not Joe Biden will be resigning, and we are not asking these same questions of Donald Trump. Obviously, those of us who do not support Donald Trump are not a part of a cult. And I think it's a perfectly accurate descriptor to say that someone who is all in with the MAGA movement is a part of a bona fide cult movement. So the goal is not to mimic what people in that camp are doing, obviously. People should be allowed to ask whether or not Joe Biden should resign. And we should not be discouraged from asking legitimate questions about his viability as a candidate. Shutting down those types of questions and that line of thinking is no better than what the Republicans are doing right now with Trump. They're enabling a dictator, and nobody wants that. But the emphasis given to this question, I feel, has just gone completely off the rails. In my estimation, from a lot of the progressive people that I talk to, that I interact with, they really just want to get past this. And if it is necessary for Biden to pass the torch to Kamala after the election, most people I know are fine with that. But CNN, the New York Times, many other publications are beating this drum to change horses in the middle of the stream to find a better candidate. Is this the right decision? Who knows? Who knows at this point? I think the biggest concern that a lot of folks have is that polling started to drop with Biden versus Trump after the debate happened. Joe Biden is now polling at 43% nationally versus Trump at 49% nationally. And when you do a cross comparison with Joe Biden versus Kamala Harris, well, Kamala's polling at 45% versus Trump's 49%. So there's still some ground to make up. But theoretically, she is in a better position, potentially, to face Trump. So after the debate, when this drumbeat started happening with a lot of these news outlets, there started to be this slow trickle of lawmakers, of Congress people who started to call on Biden to step down, who started to say, yeah, it's time. We're talking about Adam Smith of Washington, Jerry Nadler of New York, Mark Takano of California, Joe Morell of New York. They have all called for him to step down. Now I believe the number is up to 9. But at first, it really was just a very small handful of Congress people who weren't necessarily power players in Washington. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of 24-hour news for a whole lot of reasons, but because I am on edge, like a lot of people are, I have, against my better judgment, I've turned it on a couple of times in the last few days. And anytime I turn on CNN, I'm seeing this constant analysis and questioning of whether Joe Biden should step down. I think a couple of days ago, the headline was, well, there was a Parkinson's specialist that was brought out to the White House at some point. It was leaked that somehow a specialist in Parkinson's disease came out, and there is very little information that is known about why he was there or the conclusions that that doctor came to. So at this point, we are a couple of weeks out from the debate and people are still talking about this. And they're still talking about it because news outlets are still pushing this story. And eventually, a man named Reed Hastings, you may know his name. He's the head of Netflix. He's a very big donor to the Democratic Party. Reed Hastings comes out and says that he feels that Biden needs to step down. So he's really one of the first big donors to come out and say, hey, I think it's time that Biden steps down. And still through this entire process, Biden has been defiant. He has been saying, no, I'm going to stick with it. I'm the only one that can beat Trump. I have what it takes. I can do the job. I can win this thing. And I have to say, Biden has always been convincing in that respect. He has always been someone that's had a lot of grit. He has never been afraid of a difficult fight. But as he's getting older, you can see that it's becoming less and less convincing to those around him that he has the physical and mental stamina that it takes to do what he feels that he's capable of. So now we have Nancy Pelosi stepping up and basically hedging her bets and saying, well, it's up to the president to decide. She has not come out with any strong statements necessarily in support of Joe Biden. And the fact that she has made this very cautious statement about it being up to him and we're just going to see what he wants to do. She's really making a very clear statement that she's open to considering the idea of him stepping down. But the possible huge death knell in the coffin of Joe Biden's presidency is probably going to be the op-ed that George Clooney, the actor George Clooney, wrote in the New York Times, where he encouraged Joe Biden to step down for the good of the country. And for a whole lot of reasons, this has carried a lot of weight in the eyes of the public. It's carried a lot of weight in the eyes of the party. George Clooney is a huge Democratic fundraiser. In fact, he hosted a fundraiser for Biden not too long ago that he spoke about in this New York Times op-ed. And he said the version of Biden that we saw in those debates is the version that he saw at this fundraiser just a few weeks ago. And he said that he and a lot of other people were taken aback with just how impaired that Biden had been at this fundraiser, even from what he was a year ago, which is when George Clooney last had the chance to interact with him. And, you know, Biden doesn't do a whole lot of public speaking. I think there are a lot of us who really don't see him out front and in public a lot, and we really don't know a whole lot about his cognitive state. I personally find it refreshing that a president is not in the headlines every day. I remember at the height of Trump's presidency, I couldn't even turn on the news. I couldn't even listen to NPR because every day there was something more and more chaotic that was happening because of Trump himself. He was always the headline. He was always the story. So on some level, I've always appreciated the fact that Joe Biden has been much more of an undercover, under the radar player. He really doesn't need to be out front, but we know that the decisions being made behind the scenes, the administrative team that he has put together, ensure that we are in good hands. I have never felt like there was not an adult at the wheel. And it honestly just makes me question why his team would have even allowed him to do that debate at all if they knew what kind of shape he was in. I mean, obviously, it is tradition for at least a couple of debates to happen during the presidential election season. But, you know, Trump has thumbed his nose in the face of a lot of conventions and traditions. It's been a longstanding tradition that presidents submit tax returns and provide some sort of transparency and honesty around their financial life. Trump did not do that, and still he made it to the presidency. So even if people's perception was that Biden was not up to the task of doing a debate, in my estimation, he should have just brushed it off, because honestly, it would have put us in a much better position than where we are now, which is that the entire country was able to observe what we observed. And now, as a lot of people are saying, we can't unsee what we saw. I honestly would rather not have known what shape this man was in, because in my estimation, the most important thing is that Trump and all of his cronies not be allowed behind the wheel again. That is the prime directive. But we are where we are now. So George Clooney comes out with this op-ed and says, he's very concerned now the donations that the Biden-Harris campaign are receiving and a lot of the political action committees that are tied to the Democratic Party, the donations are now starting to go down quite a bit. And that's really when we start to hit the panic button, you know, when the donations go down. Because unfortunately, with the way that our political systems operate, what you are able to put and keep in those coffers, the donations, the fundraising that you are able to pull in has everything to do with how successful you are as a candidate. And if donations and fundraising start to drop off, you are in trouble. And that is where we are right now. There is also a growing concern from a lot of lawmakers that he is going to begin to drag down the ticket for some down ballot candidates. So Congress people, senators, if they are Democrats, and Democrats are not motivated to show up for the election because they don't want to vote for Joe Biden, now House of Representatives candidates, now Senate candidates, and all sorts of other Democratic candidates running for office are now going to find it more difficult to get the support that they need because a lot of Democrats just didn't show up for Biden because they were not motivated to vote for him. So now we're dealing with some systemic issues that are even bigger than Joe Biden and whether or not he will get in. Now we're potentially seeing trouble with the makeup of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And it really does create this snowball effect, unfortunately. So we are really at what would now be an inflection point. We have a senator, the first senator, Peter Welch of Vermont, who has now called on Joe Biden to step down. And it really probably is just a matter of time before this drumbeat starts to get even louder, before more senators start to call on him to step down and other major power players in Washington start to make these same calls for Joe Biden to step aside. And then, of course, the question becomes, if Joe Biden does step aside at this late hour, who takes over for him? I have always found it quite telling how quickly people are able to skip over Kamala Harris's name. I mean, there are going to be a whole slew of issues, even from a logistical standpoint, if the nominee is not Kamala Harris. And really, if you put any of the other potential nominees, Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, if you put them in a head-to-head poll against Trump, Kamala Harris outperforms all of them in head-to-head polls against Trump. So she would be the logical choice. But I think a lot of people are questioning at this point whether the United States of America is ready to elect its first woman of color as president. It's a legitimate concern, but I think if you're going to be big and bad enough to tell Joe Biden, who is the nominee, who has acquired all of the delegates that he needs to acquire in order to secure the nomination, if you are big and bad enough to tell this man that he needs to step down, then you need to be big and bad enough to accept that his VP, which is the person that he has chosen already to succeed him, we need to be able to accept that this is the next logical nominee for president of the United States. And let's not forget, the Biden-Harris campaign is sitting on about $120 million in campaign funds. If another person were to take over as the nominee for president, you can't just seamlessly pass those funds on to another person. There are a lot of legal and logistical hurdles that would have to be overcome in order for someone else to be able to use those coffers. And adding another wrinkle to this whole picture is the fact that there are a whole slew of attorneys, of lawyers on the right who are prepared to file lawsuits if the nominee is switched. They want Joe Biden to remain in place. The right wants Joe Biden to remain in place. Trump is on record as saying he hopes Joe Biden can remain in place because he knows that he has a better chance against Biden than anyone else. So they are prepared to cause as much chaos as they possibly can to prevent Joe Biden from stepping down. And as we all know, they are not afraid to play dirty. And if this should get all the way up to the Supreme Court, well, we know how that's going to go because Republicans have stacked the court for such a time as this. So I will say I was one of those people who was very resistant to the idea of Biden stepping down. You can probably hear that in a lot of my communication still. I feel like it's probably 6 of one hand, half a dozen of the other. I don't think we are necessarily going to be in a better position to switch out the candidate at this late date. I just don't. I think there are still enough people who are in support of Joe Biden that he still has a viable chance of beating Trump. Is this a difficult road? Yes, it is. But I still think he has a chance of winning. But if there is so much discontent and frustration within the party amongst people who are not diehards that they would rather stay home than to vote for Joe Biden, and obviously we know that Gaza and many other issues are also on the table right now. If there is so much discontent with these undecideds that they would stay home unless Joe Biden was taken off the ticket, well, then my opinion is go ahead and put Kamala out there. But in my estimation, it really should not be anyone other than Kamala for a variety of reasons. Then we're really asking to be thrust into a place of chaos, and that's just not what we need right now. I'm of the opinion that we need to get this settled as quickly as possible and move forward. What I don't like is this protracted conversation. It just weakens the party. It increases the chances that Trump is going to be able to take power in November. And for me and a lot of other people, that is just not a viable option. We cannot let that happen. I was watching Amanda Seales' Instagram the other day, and she made a really valid observation. She said, well, these so-called vote blue no matter who people, they are going to vote for the Democratic ticket regardless of who's on it. You could put a cactus up there, and a lot of folks would be willing to vote for that cactus if Donald Trump is the other choice. So we know that switching Joe Biden out for Kamala Harris would not be devastating for those diehard Democratic voters. But the undecideds are much more likely to have a problem with Biden being put out there as the candidate. They just are. So they are the ones that we should be making this decision for right now. And I think that's a really valid observation. Whose concerns are we really catering to? I would vote for my 13-year-old niece right now if the only other choice is Trump. So it really does not bother me necessarily if Kamala Harris is put in place. My only concern is, does she have a viable chance of beating Trump? If she does, I'm behind her. So if switching out Joe Biden for Kamala Harris is what it takes for the party to unify and to move forward and for us to put the focus back on Trump and what an awful, awful candidate he is, then let's go Kamala. It really is as simple as that. And it's starting to look like the writing is on the wall for Biden. So I can only say that I hope that there's enough time to rectify this before the convention. I hope that those folks in Biden's inner circle are able to talk some sense into him. And I hope he's able to make the decision that's best for the country. Because what we don't need is a repeat of the 1968 presidential convention. If you haven't seen Garrison Hayes' video on the parallels between this election and the election of 1968, where the Republican Richard Nixon ended up winning because of the chaos that was happening in the Democratic Party, then I would recommend that. Go and look that up on YouTube, Garrison Hayes and the parallels between the 1968 convention and the 2024 Democratic Convention. That is a scenario that none of us wants or needs. So I can only hope that the next time I speak to you that this issue is resolved one way or the other and that we are able to move forward and talk about the issues that are really in front of us, the dangers that we are facing with a potential Trump presidency. I hope that we can begin to refocus on what's important right now. As I like to remind you all every week, I hope you all are checking that voter registration. Go to vote.org/DARA, DARA. Check on your voter registration, reach out to your friends and family, ask them to check on their voter registrations. Whether you're in a red state, a blue state, a purple state, it does not matter. All hands on deck at this point. I want to thank you all for joining me for this week's episode of The Breakdown. Find me on the KJLH Instagram page and let's talk about this further. Radio Free KJLH. You can find me on my Instagram at Dara Tucker B. You can find me everywhere else at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the issues that matter once again next week. You all take care of each other. And until then, let's learn to shout.